The Russian Sleep Experiment, The Madness Within. The Sealed Tomb Days 1-5. In the shadowed late 1940s, deep within a Soviet research facility, a group of Russian researchers embarked on a project that would defy the laws of nature and morality. They selected 5 political prisoners, men deemed enemies of the state during World War II, and promised them a lie. If they could remain awake for 30 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant, they would be granted their freedom. The subjects were sealed inside a specialized chamber. The environment was meticulously controlled to monitor oxygen intake, as the stimulant gas was toxic in high concentrations. Before the era of closed-circuit cameras, monitoring was limited to microphones and small, 5-inch thick glass portholes. Inside, they had books, running water, a toilet, enough dried food for a month, and cots, but no bedding. For the first 5 days, the atmosphere was surprisingly calm. The subjects barely complained, buoyed by the false hope of liberty. However, as the gas permeated their systems, their conversations began to shift. They stopped discussing the future and started whispering about the past traumatic incidents, the horrors of the front lines, and the sins they had committed. By the 4th day, the general tone had turned dark, heavy with a weight that the researchers couldn't quite name. The descent into silence, days 6-13. After 5 days, the cracks widened. Severe paranoia set in. The subjects stopped talking to one another and began whispering individually to the microphones and the one-way mirrored portholes. In a chilling display of broken loyalty, each seemed to believe they could win the researchers' trust by betraying their comrades. On the 9th day, the first scream broke the silence. A subject ran the length of the chamber, howling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. Eventually, his voice gave out, producing only occasional squeaks. The researchers concluded he had physically torn his vocal cords. Most disturbing, however, was the reaction of the others. They ignored him completely, continuing their rhythmic whispering to the microphones. Then, a second subject began to scream. The 2 who weren't screaming took the books apart, smeared page after page with their own feces, and calmly pasted them over the glass portholes. Suddenly, the chamber went silent. No screaming, no whispering. 3 days passed in absolute stillness. The researchers checked the microphones hourly, fearing the subjects were dead. Yet, the oxygen sensors indicated a high level of consumption, the amount 5 people would consume during strenuous, heavy exercise. The intercom and the breach. Days 14-15. On the 14th day, desperate for a reaction, the researchers broke their own rules. They used the internal intercom announcing, "We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you immediate freedom." A single, calm voice responded from the darkness. "We no longer want to be free." The military and researchers debated fiercely. Finally, at midnight on the 15th day, they decided to open the tomb. They flushed the stimulant gas and pumped in fresh air. Immediately, the subjects began to beg, pleading for the gas to be turned back on, as if it were their only lifeline. When the soldiers finally entered, the screams that followed were not just from the prisoners, but from the soldiers themselves. The art of evisceration. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, though life was a generous term. The food rations hadn't been touched since day 5. Instead, chunks of flesh from the dead subject's thighs and chest were stuffed into the floor drain, causing 4 inches of a mixture of water and blood to accumulate on the floor. The survivors had been flayed. Muscle and skin were torn away from their bodies with their own bare hands, exposing bone at their fingertips. Their abdominal organs had been removed, while their hearts, lungs, and diaphragms remained in place. Their digestive tracts were visible, working in a rhythmic, sickening motion. They were digesting their own flesh. The struggle to remove them was a bloodbath. One soldier died when his throat was ripped out. Another had his femoral artery severed and his testicles torn off by a subject's teeth. 5 more soldiers would later take their own lives, unable to process the horror they had witnessed. The operating table. One subject suffered a ruptured spleen during the struggle. Despite being injected with 10 times the human dose of morphine, he fought like a cornered animal, breaking a doctor's arm. Even after his heart stopped for 2 minutes, he continued to flail and scream the word more, weaker, and weaker, until he finally fell silent. The remaining 3 were moved to surgery. The first, whose vocal cords were destroyed, only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when anesthetic gas was brought near. When a surgeon suggested doing the operation without anesthetic, the subject nodded, yes. For 6 hours, as his organs were placed back into his body, he did not flinch. A nurse noted that whenever his eyes met hers, his mouth curled into a smile. When the surgery ended, he wrote a simple message on a pad, "Keep cutting." The other 2 underwent similar surgeries, laughing continuously until they were injected with a paralytic. They demanded the gas, stating, "I must remain awake." The final revelation. The researchers wanted to euthanize them, but a KGB commanding officer saw potential and ordered they be put back into the gas. As they were wired for EEG monitoring, the subjects stopped, struggling. They wanted to go back. One subject's brainwaves were normal but periodically flatlined as if he were repeatedly suffering brain death and returning to life. Just as his eyes slipped shut for a moment, his head hit the pillow, and his brainwaves flatlined for the last time. His heart stopped simultaneously. The last subject who could speak began screaming to be sealed in now. The commanding officer ordered 3 researchers into the chamber with the 2 survivors. Terrified, one researcher drew his gun and shot the commander point blank. He then turned the gun on the mute subject, blowing his brains out. Finally, he pointed the gun at the last remaining subject, who was still restrained to a bed. "I won't be locked in here with these things. Not with you," he screamed. "What are you? I must know." The subject smiled. "Have you forgotten so easily?" he asked in a chilling, rasping voice. "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be freed at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from, in your beds, every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread." The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG monitor flatlined. In his final choking breath, the subject whispered, "So, nearly, free, and